March 15th, 2:47 p.m. The precinct holding cell on 135th Street. Bumpy Johnson sat on a steel bench, watching Officer Marcus Dolan pace outside the bars like a man who'd already won. Dolan had 17 years on the force, 43 commendations, and a reputation for breaking suspects without leaving marks. He stood 6'2", muscular, with a scar running down his left cheek that made him look like he'd survived things normal men couldn't. "Your grandmother's case is closed," Dolan said through the bars, his voice steady and certain. "Fell down her own stairs. Happens all the time with old people. No witnesses, no evidence, no case. You're looking at 23 years minimum for the heroin we found in your apartment, heroin you put there." Everyone expected Bumpy to break, to rage, to demand lawyers he couldn't afford and make threats that would only add charges to his sentence. But what Dolan didn't know, Bumpy Johnson had been documenting everything for the last 6 weeks. Every officer who walked that precinct, every conversation overheard through cell walls, every piece of information that moved through the system like currency. 37 days later, Officer Marcus Dolan walked into his precinct for his morning shift and found federal agents waiting at his locker. Dolan's face went white. His hands trembled as they showed him the photographs. This is the story of how Bumpy Johnson turned a rigged system against itself, how he transformed defeat into something the NYPD would remember for decades. But here's the question: how does a man sitting in a cell with no power, no phone, and no freedom manage to dismantle a decorated police officer? The 135th Street precinct wasn't just a building, it was a kingdom. Officer Marcus Dolan wasn't just a cop, he was the kingdom's enforcer. Between 1958 and 1962, Dolan had built a reputation for shaking down dealers, planting evidence on Harlem's most dangerous men, and keeping the system running exactly the way he wanted it. He'd arrested 68 men in 4 years. 59 of them had served time. The other 9 had disappeared entirely from the neighborhood. People whispered that Dolan answered to someone higher up, someone in City Hall or the FBI, someone who needed Harlem's criminal element controlled. The precinct operated on a simple principle: power. The most violent men had power. The men with connections had power. Bumpy Johnson had both, which made him dangerous, which made him a target. Dolan's track record was undeniable. 43 commendations. 0 civilian complaints filed that didn't mysteriously disappear within weeks. He'd survived internal investigations that would have destroyed other officers. He'd beaten accusations of evidence tampering, corruption, and assault. To the department, Dolan was untouchable. To Harlem, he was the system-made flesh, brutal, unpredictable, and completely protected by the machinery that employed him. This was the world Bumpy faced, not a fair fight, not even a remotely fair system, but a machine that had forgotten one crucial detail. Bumpy Johnson didn't fight like normal men. 9 weeks earlier, January 8, 1962, Bumpy's grandmother, Elise Johnson, was 73 years old and didn't trust police. She lived on East 112th Street in a brownstone with 3 floors and a narrow staircase that creaked when you walked down it. She'd lived there for 41 years. She knew every board, every corner, every angle of that house, like it was part of her body. That morning, she heard a knock at 6:15 a.m. 4 officers stood on her doorstep with a warrant to search the premises for narcotics. "We got a tip that your grandson's been running operations from this address," Dolan said, stepping past her into the hallway. He wasn't asking permission. He didn't need it. Elise tried to block them from going upstairs. She stood in front of Dolan, all 4'11" of her, and said, "You're not searching anything without my lawyer present." Dolan smiled. Then he reached out and pushed her backward. Not hard, just hard enough. Hard enough that she lost her footing on the 3rd step, tumbled down the entire flight, and cracked 3 ribs and her left hip against the hardwood. The officers found nothing. The warrant was fraudulent. But Elise was 73 and broken. Bumpy got word while he was at a number's house in Washington Heights. His grandmother didn't call him. She knew they'd be listening. Instead, she sent Marcus Tibbs, a runner, with a message. "Tell Bumpy I fell." Bumpy understood. He'd spent 41 years learning to read what people didn't say. He went to see her the same evening. Her hip was wrapped. Her ribs were taped. She was moving like a woman twice her age. "Dolan?" he asked. She nodded once. That was all he needed. The next day, Bumpy had a meeting with Dolan at a coffee shop on 125th Street at 2 p.m. "My grandmother says she had an accident," Bumpy said, stirring his coffee slowly, methodically. "Says a police officer was in the house." Dolan laughed. He actually laughed. "Your grandmother fell. Old people fall. Happens every day. You got a problem with that. You take it up with the commissioner. Good luck with that, Johnson." But that's when Bumpy smiled, not angry. Thoughtful. Like he'd just learned something important. He started going everywhere with a notebook. Not obvious about it, just small observations. Officer Dolan arrives at Precinct 6:42 a.m. every Tuesday. Dolan takes 15-minute breaks at Mickey's Diner on 124th Street every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Dolan meets with a man in a gray coat, someone from the DA's office, maybe City Hall outside the cathedral on 42nd Street once a month. Bumpy was logging, documenting, building a map of Dolan's life, his routines, his connections. On February 3rd, a dealer named Raymond was arrested on Dolan's say-so. Raymond was good people. Raymond sold heroin, sure, but he didn't rob, didn't kill, didn't hurt civilians. 3 weeks later, Raymond took his own life in a holding cell. Dolan's arrest record ticked up to 59. Raymond was erased. 2 weeks after that, a woman named Sheila was stopped on the street by Dolan and 2 officers. They claimed they found cocaine in her purse. Sheila swore she'd never touched cocaine. Her trial was scheduled for 6 months out. Her baby was 6 months old. Her mother was sick. Sheila took a plea deal and went inside for 3 years. Bumpy saw Sheila's mother crying outside the courthouse. That's when he understood something crucial. Dolan didn't just hurt him. Dolan hurt the entire neighborhood. And the neighborhood was watching Bumpy to see what he'd do. By late February, Bumpy had identified 17 people arrested on Dolan's testimony that he believed were fraudulent. 17 people. He had visited 12 of them in prison. He had talked to their families. He had their stories, all locked in his mind. Then, on March 1st, Dolan arrested Bumpy on a drug charge. The heroin was real. Bumpy didn't deny it. But Dolan planted it. Bumpy saw him do it in the apartment, watched him take the packet from his jacket pocket and drop it into Bumpy's bedroom drawer while his partner looked the other way. That's when Bumpy started smiling in the interrogation room. Because Dolan had just made his final mistake, Bumpy took the bait perfectly. When they found the heroin, he didn't rage, he didn't call for lawyers. He just sat there quietly while Dolan explained the charges: possession with intent to distribute, felony drug charge, 23 years minimum. Dolan was so confident he barely looked at Bumpy. He was already planning his next arrest, his next commendation, his next victim. They processed Bumpy at the 135th Street precinct at 4:30 p.m. on March 1st. They fingerprinted him, photographed him, took his personal effects, watch, wallet, keys. Then they put him in a holding cell while they arranged transport to the Tombs, the city jail down in Lower Manhattan where he'd sit until trial. What Dolan thought was happening. Bumpy Johnson was finally going away. 23 years in prison meant no more influence, no more network, no more threat to Dolan's operation. It was a victory. It was perfect. What was actually happening? Bumpy had activated his network. While Bumpy sat in that cell on 135th Street, 5 different people were moving simultaneously. Marcus Tibbs, the runner, went to a newspaper reporter named Catherine Wells at the Daily News. He carried with him a folder containing 17 case files, arrest reports, and testimonies from families of Dolan's victims. Wells had been investigating police corruption for 18 months. She'd been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence. Meanwhile, Tommy Watts, a bail bondsman with connections to everyone from Harlem to the Bronx, made a phone call to Assistant District Attorney Richard Morrison. "I've got information about a cop on the take," Watts said. "Someone you'll want to know about." Morrison agreed to a meeting for the next morning. At the same time, Bumpy's cousin Willie was making his own calls to a man who worked in the FBI's field office on 69th Street. That man owed Bumpy a favor from 1956, back when Bumpy had warned him about a heroin shipment coming through the docks. The FBI had seized 8 kilos that day. The agent had never forgotten it. Inside the holding cell, Bumpy wasn't broken. He was calm. He knew exactly what was happening on the street. His cellmate, a man named Deshawn, who was waiting for trial on an assault charge, asked him, "You worried?" Bumpy shook his head. "Worried about what?" he said. "Officer Dolan just gave me everything I needed." 48 hours after Bumpy's arrest, 3 separate entities had the same information. Detailed documentation that Officer Marcus Dolan was a corrupt cop who planted evidence, framed suspects, and worked outside the law. Dolan had no idea. He came to work on March 3rd at 6:42 a.m., just like he always did. He signed in. He got his coffee. He was checking paperwork when his lieutenant called him into his office. "We're going to need you to come with us," the lieutenant said quietly. Behind him stood 2 men in dark suits. Federal agents. Bumpy had been planning this for 6 weeks. Not planning how to escape, not planning violence or retaliation, planning documentation. From the moment Dolan pushed his grandmother down the stairs, Bumpy had been gathering intelligence like a man preparing for war. Here's what Bumpy had that Dolan didn't know about. Witnesses. Actual, credible witnesses who'd come forward once they understood the protection they'd get. Marcus Tibbs, who'd seen Dolan plant evidence on a dealer named Jackson back in November. Dr. Patricia Hayes, the emergency room physician who'd treated 8 of Dolan's victims and noticed a suspicious pattern in their injuries. Thomas Chen, a prisoner who'd been released 6 months earlier and was now working as a paralegal at the legal aid office. Chen had reviewed 17 of Dolan's cases and found contradictions in 54% of them. Between January 8th and March 1st, Bumpy had built a case file so detailed, so specific, so undeniable that 3 separate institutions simultaneously decided to move against Dolan. The first domino fell on March 3rd at 8:15 a.m., when FBI agents arrived at the precinct with a warrant to investigate Officer Marcus Dolan for civil rights violations under the Civil Rights Act of 1960. The second domino fell at 8:47 a.m., when Catherine Wells published a story in the Daily News with the headline, "Harlem Cop Accused of Massive Frame-Up Scheme, 17 Cases Under Review." The third domino fell at 9:30 a.m., when ADA Richard Morrison presented the evidence to the police commissioner. Dolan's face went gray. Not because he was guilty, he knew he was guilty, but because he suddenly understood that the system he'd been using to protect himself was now being used to destroy him. By noon on March 3rd, Dolan had been suspended pending investigation. By March 15th, the FBI had reopened all 17 cases. By March 22nd, Dolan had retained a private attorney. By April 4th, he'd been formally charged with 3 counts of civil rights violations, 4 counts of evidence tampering, and 1 count of perjury. Bumpy didn't have to do anything himself. He'd built a system where the evidence spoke for itself. The newspaper was doing the public pressure. The FBI was doing the investigation. The DA was doing the prosecution. Dolan didn't have anything Bumpy didn't know about, because Bumpy had spent 6 weeks learning everything about Dolan that mattered. What changed everything was the moment Dolan realized who'd set him up. It was Catherine Wells who told him, right there in the interrogation room on March 18th. The information came from inside, she said. "From someone close to your department, someone patient enough to document 6 weeks of your operations." Dolan's hands started shaking. He understood then. He'd walked into a trap so perfectly constructed that he'd helped build it himself every single day he came to work. His network of allies? Useless. His commendations? Irrelevant. His reputation? Destroyed the moment the press hit. His position? Gone. Meanwhile, Bumpy walked out of the 135th Street precinct on March 17th, charges dismissed. Not innocent. Charges dismissed. The heroin they'd found was real, but it was inadmissible as evidence, because it had been planted by a corrupt officer. The entire arrest became toxic. 3 days later, Officer Marcus Dolan was officially suspended from the NYPD pending trial. The investigation took 17 weeks. In that time, 5 other officers were also suspended for evidence tampering. 2 resigned quietly. 1 took early retirement at 41 years old, destroyed, finished, gone. Dolan's trial lasted 6 weeks. He was convicted on 2 counts of civil rights violations in September 1962. He served 8 years in federal prison. He was released in 1970 at age 52, effectively exiled from law enforcement, unable to work in security or any related field. The ripple effects were immediate. The police department's internal affairs division was completely restructured. The evidence procedures changed. 38 cases were reopened. 21 convictions were overturned. 12 men were released from prison. The families got apologies. Some got settlements. The system had been forced to acknowledge its own corruption. Bumpy's status changed overnight. He went from target to untouchable. Officers who'd been harassing him suddenly stopped. The precinct captains started treating him like a presence to be acknowledged rather than combated. He had 17 people who owed him their freedom or their dignity. He had federal agents who understood he was valuable. He had a neighborhood that knew he'd struck at the system itself and won. 6 months after Dolan's suspension, another corrupt officer named Detective Samuel Rivera started fabricating evidence against a youth named Marcus Washington. 3 people, Tommy Watts, Marcus Tibbs, and Dr. Patricia Hayes, went to the FBI with their information before Rivera could even make the arrest. Rivera was investigated and removed before he ever had the chance to destroy someone. By 1963, the word had spread through every precinct in New York. Bumpy Johnson didn't just survive. Bumpy Johnson dismantled. Dolan died in 1,996 inches, a small apartment in Queens, age 76. Alone, his name permanently associated with one case file, the corruption that brought him down. He never held a job in law enforcement again. He never had the respect he'd stolen. He never escaped what he'd done to Elise Johnson that morning in January. Meanwhile, Bumpy's grandmother lived another 9 years. She saw her grandson transform from marked man into legend. She saw the system that had attacked her become accountable, if only partially, if only for a moment. This story proves something fundamental about power that most people never understand. The most powerful weapon isn't violence. It's documentation. It's patience. It's knowing your enemy so completely that you understand what he'll do before he does it. Bumpy Johnson didn't beat Officer Marcus Dolan because he was stronger or meaner or more connected. Dolan had 17 years of authority, institutional backing, and a track record of destruction. Bumpy had something else. He had attention. He paid attention to everything. He noticed patterns. He documented facts. He built a case so complete that when he finally moved, 3 separate institutions moved with him. This is why Bumpy became legendary in Harlem. Not because he was the most violent man. Not because he made the most money, but because he understood something about systems that most criminals never figure out. You can't beat a corrupt system by fighting it directly. You have to use its own machinery against itself. You have to document its contradictions. You have to present evidence so undeniable that the system has no choice but to devour its own. Strategy beats violence. Patience beats force. Documentation beats denial, Bumpy would later say to people who asked how he'd done it. I didn't have to beat anybody. I just had to remember everything they did and show it to the people who get paid to stop them. Today, we live in a world where every action is documented. Every conversation can be recorded. Every transaction leaves a trace. The lesson of Bumpy Johnson and Officer Dolan is more relevant now than it ever was. The person who documents, who pays attention, who builds the complete picture, that person holds the real power. Not the person with the badge. Not the person with the authority. The person with the evidence. March 1st, 1962, Bumpy Johnson arrested on planted evidence. March 17th, 1962, charges dismissed, Officer Dolan suspended, the entire system forced to reckon with itself. How does a man sitting in a holding cell dismantle a decorated police officer? By never forgetting a single detail. If this story showed you that intelligence beats authority and patience beats force, smash that subscribe button right now. Drop a like if you believe that documentation and attention to detail are the most powerful weapons we have. Comment this. Are you more impressed by brute strength or strategic brilliance, and why? Remember, the person who controls the narrative doesn't always win. The person who documents the facts always does.